right. Appreciate everyone being here. We'll call this meeting to order. I think I know most everyone here, but just in case I don't, I'm Kevin Tanner. I'm chair of the House Transportation Committee, and I've been named by the Speaker to co-chair this commission. Appreciate you being here, and in just a few minutes we're going to go around the room and let everyone introduce themselves, or around the table and let everyone introduce themselves and tell us who you represent. But before we do that, I'd like to call on my co-chair, Senator Brandon Beach, for some special introductions.
Well, welcome everybody. This is a great crowd, and you know, when you think about what we've done in transportation since 2015, we addressed transportation funding with House Bill 170, and I saw Jay Roberts. Where's Jay? Thank you for being here, Jay. If you need something, he's the guy with the money, so he's right there at that back door. But thank you. You and Steve Gooch really worked hard on House Bill 170, and then Kevin and I, our chairman and I, worked hard on House Bill 930. So we've addressed transportation funding, we've addressed transit, and now it's time to look at freight and logistics. And I was telling somebody earlier, somebody came up to me the other day about this, and they said, well, you know, y'all are the freight and logistics capital for the Southeast. I said, no, we're not. We're the freight and logistics capital for the Eastern Seaboard. I mean, when you really think about what we do here in the state of Georgia, moving goods through our state and where they go, it's unbelievable. So we've got to address this and make sure that we can move goods and services in a really an exponential way. So anyway, I would like to introduce the GDOT board. We've got Chairman Ann Purcell. Chairman, thank you. We've got Don Grantham. Don, thank you. Jamie Boswell and Kevin Abel. Thank you all. Is there any other GDOT board members? Those are the only ones I saw. Thank you for your service. Secretary Chow recognized you the other day, yesterday actually, at the Georgia Chamber Congressional Lunch. Thank you, Chris, for having her. Secretary Chow, she really bragged about what the GDOT board did and what y'all are doing for the state of Georgia. So thank y'all for your service. It's very well appreciative. So, and thank y'all for letting us have the meeting here and hosting us. Appreciate that. Also, before we get started, I just want to thank the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker for allowing us to come together and do this joint commission. Both of those are showing leadership on this issue, and the Speaker has been leading on House Bill 170, House Bill 930, and I met with him not long ago, and he is really wanting to lead on this issue too, as well as Jeff Duncan, our Lieutenant Governor. So I look forward, and we've got some really bright people around this table, and I think we'll come up with some great solutions. So with that, I guess what we'll do is go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves. I will tell you the two senators we have, I'll introduce. Steve Gooch, and I'll let you introduce yourself, and Burt Jones, and thank you as my colleagues for serving on this. So you want to start, we'll start down here and just go around the table.
Thanks, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tom Gale, and I'm the Director of the Governmental Relations Office for the Georgia Municipal Association, filling in for our Executive Director, Larry Hanson.
If everybody would push their green button when it's time to talk, you can be heard. I'm Russell McMurray, the Commissioner for Georgia DOT, and welcome to GDOT. Thanks for having the first meeting here. It's very convenient for us.
Good.
I'm Ed McCarthy, the Chief Operating Officer for the Georgia Port Authority, filling in for Executive Director Griff Lynch.
George Powers, President and CEO of Trade Port Logistics in Savannah.
Hello, Felicia Moore. I'm President of the Atlanta City Council, and I will say this before I will have to leave. We have a special call council meeting, so if you see me leave early, it's because we're taking care of the city's business. Thank you.
Good morning. Steve Gooch, State Senator from District 51. It's portions of Forsyth County, Dawson, Lumpkin, White, Union, Fannin, Gilmer, and Pickens. Good to be with everyone.
Dale Rutledge, State Representative, District 109, which is Henry, Rockdale, and Newton County.
State Representative Calvin Smyrie, representing Columbus.
Senator Burt Jones from Jackson, Georgia, represent District 25, which covers 10 counties in middle Georgia, all the way from Bibb to Lake Oconee, Lake Sinclair area. So great to be here. Thank you, Chair.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Smith. I'm a Senior Vice President of Supply Chain at Home Depot.
Hi, good morning. I'm Rick Toole. I'm the Vice President with Alfred Benish and Company, engineering, transportation, infrastructure firm.
I'm Brad Skinner. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Omnitrax, which is headquartered in Denver, Colorado.
Hello, I'm Hala Modelmog, President and CEO of the Metro Atlanta Chamber, and happy to be here. Happy to hopefully continue this work on our transportation, transit, and logistics. So thank you.
Good morning, Derek Johnson, President of UPS in the South Atlantic District, which has Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Glad to be here.
Good morning, I'm Chris Clark. I'm President of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce.
Good morning. I'm Steve Taylor, Bartow County Commissioner.
Good morning, Dave Wills, Executive Director of ACCG, representing the counties of the state.
All right, thank you very much. As you can see, I think we have a very distinguished group of leaders from all over Georgia representing many different industries and public entities that all have an expertise in freight, logistics, and our chamber partners who have an interest in continuing to find ways to improve how we move transit in and out of our state. So looking forward to accomplishing good things with this commission and working with our partners in the audience and others across Georgia as we look for real solutions. Chairman Beach and I have talked, and we don't come to the table having all the answers, so we're looking forward to pulling from your knowledge and your backgrounds, and also that of GDOT and others that we're going to hear from today and throughout our meetings this year, and come up with some solutions we can recommend back to the General Assembly. This morning, what we wanted to try to accomplish today is to try to lay a foundation for what we understand and know about our needs in freight, logistics. GDOT puts together a plan, and they've been working on updating that plan. It's very detailed, I believe, and the Commissioner can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's actually in our books. A copy of that plan is in your binders. If you didn't pick up your binder, there's one over in the corner with your name on it. That if you would, keep that with you and bring that to all of our meetings. We'll be providing you materials so we can keep it all in one place. But this morning, we've asked GDOT to present, the Commissioner McMurray, to present the Freight and Logistics Plan. He's going to do that, and then after that, we'll hear from the Department of Economic Development as we start to lay the foundation for where we are in Georgia. Commissioner McMurray doesn't need any introduction, but I will say that he's been a tremendous partner for the General Assembly and all of us, quite honestly, on this panel. As he's led not only in Georgia's but recognized as a leader around the country in the area of transportation, developed a wonderful relationship with Secretary of Transportation at the national level, continues to pay dividends for us here in Georgia. He's someone that I'm proud to call my former district engineer up in the Gainesville district that covers the area that I personally represent. So I've known Commissioner McMurray before many of you in the room knew him as Commissioner, and he did a good job for us locally, came up through the ranks of GDOT, and has shown he's leading GDOT like never before. So Commissioner, thank you for what you do, and thank you for allowing us to be here today and for your board and their hospitality. And at this time, we'll turn it over to you to present the Freight and Logistics Plan.
Thank you, Chairman Tanner, for that introduction, and thank you, Chairman Beach, for being here. Thank you all for attending. This is really exciting, and I just want to thank the leadership from both House and Senate for making freight and logistics a relevant discussion point that we need to focus on for Georgia to keep our competitive edge that we have in Georgia. And so it's really a great opportunity to come together. Again, thank you for acknowledging our board members, State Transportation Board members here with us today. Also would like to acknowledge that we have our federal highway partners with us today. Moises Marrero is here with us, who is the Division Administrator for the Atlanta region, and his assistant is here as well. So we're glad to have them in the audience. And I'll just say before we start, I'd like to thank our staff in advance for a tremendous volume of information in front of you. So don't be scared of that handout that you have that is some 70 slides. We're going to have a robust discussion, and as Chairman Tanner said, we're going to try to set the table a little bit of what freight and freight logistics look like for Georgia. And that sort of informs you, and each of you have your own areas of subject matter expertise, but this is sort of trying to set the table of sort of the baseline of how this commission can go forward and look at freight and logistics in the manner that was set up for this commission itself. So that's the goal today, is sort of to set the table. So the monitors you should be able to follow along with. So I just want to lay out the agenda. So we want to talk a little bit of the national perspective of freight, drill down a little bit to the statewide perspective of what freight looks like in Georgia, and then take a little bit deeper dive into the actual modal plans for air, waterways, freight rail, and highways, touch a little bit on sort of the state of infrastructure, and then finally sort of wrap up as some things to think about as this commission moves ahead and moves forward into the future. So let's jump into some national perspectives of freight. And this first slide is probably not surprising. We try to source everything, and it may be hard to read. And as you look at this information, some of it may look a little dated. The chart on the left only goes to 2011. But just think about that same trajectory continuing on and maybe getting a little steeper as it looks at truck, railroad, pipeline, waterborne, and air ton miles, which is a way to measure how freight is moved, ton miles, and you in the freight industry certainly understand that. The chart on the right talks a little bit about what's anticipated from 2015 to 2040, again on the national level of continued growth. And I think we all understand that freight mobility and freight movement will continue to grow. And you can certainly see on the left side of the chart sort of the downturn that happened, and then the economic downturn, and then we're off from there. So the trend is continued growth, and I think that's why we're here. That certainly was the charge of how do we get ready for that. And when we move in again to look at national perspective, looking at truck and rail growth, you can see that trajectory again, especially in truck. You can see the economic downturn, and it's just on a linear growth pattern, almost on a 45-degree angle. And you can see rail ticking up some more as we look into the future. And it's interesting to see when you look at this, this gives us the charge statement again, how do we keep Georgia the #1 place in which to do business when we see the growth that's coming on a national level. It's interesting to note that transportation costs represent about 8% of the U.S.'s GDP. So it's a big percentage, freight and transportation, that transportation cost along is a big percentage of GDP overall. And 40% of S&P 500 companies say that freight and transportation costs are the most substantial risk to earnings, is that variability in what that freight cost is to getting goods to market. So something this commission certainly should be focused on as we go forward. Now, again, sort of a national perspective, if we look at distribution markets, here's the top 18 distribution markets in this country. No surprising that Georgia has got a flag there. These look like golf course. It's like little golf course holes. I like that. And don't worry, top 18, Georgia is top 10. The last one I saw this, I think Georgia was number 6 when you look at distribution markets. And if you look at this map and think about the U.S., it sort of corresponds with population centers. As you think about the population of this nation and you look at those areas, you can see sort of where those things lie. So it makes sense that distribution markets happen where population is. And then as we drill down a little further, sort of on the national perspective of if we look at the industrial space that corresponds to population centers, in this next slide, you can see Georgia's about the 3 o'clock on the dial there. A big sector of Atlanta, metro Atlanta, shows up among the other cities. And I think the things that we think about is how does Georgia maintain its competitiveness? Look at these other areas that have a similar slice of pie, being Philly, sort of the Inland Empire up in the East Coast, on the eastern seaboard, and Dallas, Fort Worth. And then you can look at some of the other ones, and surprisingly, there's Charlotte down there. We think about Charlotte as being our competitor often, but they have a very small market share of industrial space. And again, industrial not only leads to jobs, but leads to freight and freight mobility and freight movements needs. So I think, again, this was no surprise probably when you think about it, but it's nice to see how Atlanta stacks up. Moving next is, as we think about freight and freight distribution at the national level, is how do we look and how do we compare to other inland distribution hubs? So not seaports, but when you look at freight and freight mobility, how do we look compared nationally? And if you look at these three main freight distribution hubs, being Atlanta, Dallas, and Chicago, if you take a look at this map, the veins and the arteries are thicker for the tons of freight moved, and you can see the legend to the side. And when you look at this, the majority, 60% of Atlanta's truck traffic serve basically the southeast markets. But I do highlight, if you look at that red vein, if you look, it goes all the way to California. Look how far freight moves in and out of Georgia, and specifically Atlanta, across this nation. And also, Atlanta has a little bit higher tonnage of freight moved on truck, about 84% compared to the 70% national average. And our friends in the railroad behind us certainly would like to drive that number down, right? So if you think about if you look at Chicago, there's more freight being moved on rail proportionally than to Georgia, in and out of those distribution areas. But I thought this was a nice chart, again, to give some perspective of how big distribution hubs and the effect they have of where freight travels across this country. Again, freight comes to population. So what about Georgia's population? We've already heard from the Atlanta Regional Commission to expect 2 million more people in Metro Atlanta. Here is a chart from the University of Virginia that shows where Georgia is now ranked about 8th in population, but by 2040 as high as 5th. So again, as population, as we continue to add people, then freight becomes important to serve the people that the population centers hold. So going from 8th to 5th certainly poses challenges. And again, a good challenge statement for this very commission to think about of how do we respond and prepare along the way for increasing population. So let's drill down now from the national perspective to talk a little bit more about the overview of Georgia freight and what it looks like. So when we look at Georgia freight, first and foremost, some 562 million tons of freight originate or terminate in Georgia based on some 2017 data. You know, there's always a data lag on how we get data from different data sources, but 2017 is pretty current for that purpose. These charts show the outbound tons, the inbound tons, how much goes back and forth within the state, and then the total share. And so it's maybe a little hard to see, but the orange is for trucks, blue is for rail, green is for pipeline, and yellow is for air. And you can see some 0 percentages that are for other and water. And when I say water, don't get excited, and Ed's not going to get excited for Georgia Ports Authority. This is only talking about barge traffic, anything that's navigable waters, not port traffic, container traffic in and out. So that's why water does not show up on this. And this also doesn't capture any freight that's just through Georgia. This is inbound, outbound, and within Georgia. And I'll take a deeper dive to explain that later. But you can see the modal share. 75% overall is truck, 15% rail, 9% pipeline, and then you can sort of see how that is. Of course, when you look intrastate, it sort of makes sense that most of those freight moves are via truck, and when you're doing short haul within the state itself. And as you look for outbound, you can see inbound and outbound, rail has a bigger share for bringing things in and out. So I think this is interesting, again, to say, look at what this helps inform the challenge statement of how do we solve freight and freight logistics, is looking at these modal shares, so to speak, of where freight's coming and going. All right, so when you got here today and came over today, did you feel like traffic as heavy as it's ever been? Well, there's a reason for that. The national trends show us that traffic volumes are the highest that they've ever been, including ahead of the economic downturn. So we've passed that point, and traffic volumes are continuing to grow. This is a great resource from the Federal Highway that does traffic volume trends. They do year to year, month comparison to month from year to year. And this is a snapshot back in May. And I think this, again, to inform sort of what the Georgia perspective is, that traffic volume nationally in May grew by 1%. So what does that turn into? And this is a staggering number. 1% is 3 billion more miles traveled in the month of May of 2019 as compared to May 2018. 3 billion miles traveled nationally. That's a huge number. And so the breakdown is that about 199, almost 200 million of that was on urban roads and streets. And only the balance, almost the other 100, was on rural roads. Now, the nation grew at 1%, but look to the right on the South Atlantic that grew by 3.2%. And if you look at the rest of the nation, you can see North Central actually declined in traffic growth. But you can see that South Atlantic is what's carrying the day as we see tremendous growth in traffic volume in total. In Georgia, I believe, was somewhere, I think we were around 2%. I have to look back, but we were one of the higher of the South Atlantic. We always see that Florida and North Carolina in the South Atlantic are either pacing us or outpacing us in traffic growth. So just sort of, again, to give you some comparisons of who's growing. Sometimes Virginia, but just to know that if you feel like traffic's heavier than it's ever been, it's because it's true. Traffic volumes are heavier than they've ever been. This next slide is maybe one of my favorite slides, and we have several that are similar. And it's the notion of the freight corridors by tonnage by mode. And I know it's a little small and hard to see, but red are interstate highways. The gray is non-interstate, sort of the brown is railroad, and you got inland. But the fatter the line, the wider the line, the heavier the freight volume. And if you look in there in the middle of the United States, sort of the Midwest there's an inset of Georgia that's broken out. And this slide is a little bit old. It's a little bit of a dated slide, but it's still, the relativity of it is still perfect. If you look at Georgia, and you look at the arteries of the interstate of Georgia, you can see that I-75 carries the day as it looks at freight tons moved on the interstate system. But I think if you take that inset of Georgia and you look at the rest of the nation, including California and Texas in the Northeast, we have as much freight tons moved through Georgia than any other state, or at least comparably speaking. So, sort of like I like to, tell my kids sometimes, Georgia's a big deal. Let's not lose sight that Georgia is a big deal when it comes to this nation and the impact it has on freight and freight logistics. So we're going to have some more slides and a little more detail to take a deeper dive into this, but it's one of my favorite slides to look at as how do we compare nationally of freight tons moved throughout the state. And it's like I say, the other modes are a little hard to see, but it certainly highlights the criticality of the interstate system and what it plays in moving freight. So moving in a little more freight assets here in Georgia, that interstate system, like I said, was so vital. In fact, Georgia has 15 interstates. See if you can name them in your head. There's two that people always forget. Maybe Steve won't forget them, but there's two that people forget. But Georgia's interstates connect to 31% directly connect to 31% of the lower 48 states. So we have a great reach of our interstate system, and you'll see in a moment why freight can flow so well. And of course, Ed and the team at GPA will tell you that Savannah is obviously the westernmost East Coast port, which has an advantage of truck haul for sure, and freight reaching across the state. Of course, we have Metro Atlanta here, which is founded on freight movement of the city of Terminus. So when we've come a long way from being Terminus to Atlanta today, but the freight part of that and the rail part of it being a railroad hub here in Metro Atlanta of our two Class I railroads certainly is foundational and give us great opportunity. Obviously, Hartsfield-Jackson gives us opportunity with our airports. The other airports is maybe hard to see on the icons. I will talk about later about air cargo and what that means. But if you look at the 4,600 miles of rail, and now with what's happening between the intersection of rail and the ports, with 3 inland ports, 2 active and 1 under development. And we'll talk about that in a little detail later on. But you can see that we have great freight assets as well as what we know we have on the coast with Savannah and Brunswick. Largest and fastest growing container port in the United States, 4th busiest container port.
And the next meeting, we'll get a highlight of the great work GPA's done and more metrics and details about them. And of course, in Brunswick is number 2 behind Baltimore for vehicle imports and exports, roll on, roll off. And I would just say, if you ever want to go buy a car, go visit them. There's every car you can imagine sitting down there in Brunswick. So biggest car lot you'll ever see. Pretty amazing. So let's talk about some of the industry that drives freight in Georgia and remind ourselves and maybe educate ourselves about where these things happen. And again, freight distribution happens, and it takes warehousing and fulfillment centers to make that happen. So here's a map of Georgia's distribution industries, 500,000 square feet and above. So think about that. That's not a small warehouse, 500,000 square foot and above. And you can see where they are, and I think it's interesting to note that Interstate 85 corridor. You can see density of those distribution centers around the 85 corridor. Obviously down in Savannah and Macon and Central Georgia and Albany, and you start looking at those. If you look at this slide too, the top right are distributions of centers of 1.5 million square feet and above. And I noticed there's probably a few more that need to be added to this due to some recent announcements and things coming forward. So when you start looking at that, it's pretty impressive to see, okay, where are these freight distribution centers in Georgia? You know, Georgia has an automotive industry, and if I were to ask you where do you think most of the automotive manufacturing is in the state, most of everybody would say West Georgia, or Kia. But here is a map of the automotive manufacturing across the state. And you can see these are 50-plus workers. This is companies that employ 50-plus people. The top right corner, you can see the employment by company. Of course, Kia is the largest. And obviously a great industry that supports not only Kia, but if we think about our neighbors to Alabama that has Mercedes, Tennessee with Volkswagen, South Carolina has got BMW. You think about all the auto manufacturing in and around the Southeast, these companies support that and really support the supply chain. And I think most of you know that Kia and these manufacturing companies work with limited inventory. It's just in time. Usually with 3 to 4 hours of goods and supplies on the floor in the assembly at one time. So just in time freight logistics is critical to keep those companies running and their production numbers where they need to be. The bottom right corner also talks a little bit about the transportation equipment exports. Just remind ourselves of Caterpillar, Kubota, JCB, and others that are in this state that export a lot of equipment as well, and certainly have meaningful job numbers as well. As we think about other freight movement and freight types in this state, obviously agriculture is our #1 business, and it's very important that we focus on our #1 business. And this turns into food production. So agriculture turns into food production. Again, a map of 50-plus employees food processing. You can see the top employers over to the top right. One of those being just across the street for the world headquarters of Coke. But if you look just below that, you see the poultry industry and what it means to the state. I believe we do have one expert in that industry on this commission that knows a little something about the poultry industry and how critical it is. So Chairman Tanner, we certainly know you have a lot of insight in that, but I think you can see how many jobs that industry creates directly. And again, if you look at the bottom right, Georgia is ranked #6 nationally with over 71,000 jobs. And also we're #1 in the Southeast as it comes to food production. But again, seeing this perspective of the entire state of where these companies are, I think is pretty impressive to show that, you know, this is a statewide matter and issue that has to be looked into. Now let's move ahead a little bit that we understand the national perspective, some of the Georgia perspective, and how do we turn that into our planning efforts? So what do we really do with that? And what I'd like to do is sort of highlight the efforts by GDOT to plan for this information that we know and understand and how we start planning for the future. So as we move forward, GDOT's taken this data and lots of other data and basically built a suite of transportation plans that from a statewide freight and logistics plan to rail plans to airport plans of which I think most of those are in the binders that you have. But those inform us to two of our major planning documents that we utilize. One of those is the statewide strategic transportation plan, and the other is a federally mandated statewide transportation plan. The strategic statewide transportation plan is updated every 2 years with a primary goal of achievement of economic growth in Georgia, targeting key capital investment strategies, and really to drive the identification and selection of projects that that are necessary to develop the State Transportation Improvement Plan, which is a 4-year plan. The statewide transportation plan is that federal plan that is a broad multimodal transportation plan that addresses issues, trends, and needs over the 20-year horizon. And that helps, again, support selection of projects that we move forward with. So that's got a 20-year look. And as I talk about these plans and all this data you've seen, I just really want to, again, brag on our staff, because we have a lot of professionals here that are really in tune with this information and data and trying to drive Georgia forward. And especially I'd like to highlight one of our guys in planning, a guy named Tom McQueen. I think Tom is here. Tom is a AICP certified. That means the American Institute of Certified Planners, which is the preeminent certification of planners and professionals. They have to pass an exam. They have to demonstrate their knowledge of planning, and also adhere to a code of efforts. But here's some of Tom's credentials that help drive this forward. He chairs the National American Association of State and Highway Transportation Officials Freight Task Force. He's a member of the Special Committee on Freight. He's a member of the Transportation Research Board, which is part of the National Academy for Sciences, Freight Committees for Freight Planning and Logistics. And he also participates in many research projects, as well as the co-chair of the I-95 Coalition for Intermodal Freight. Georgia is one member of all the Eastern Seaboard states that focus on freight movement and movement along I-95. So he co-chairs that. But we also have a great team in our intermodal division, headed up by Carol Comer and her team that focuses on rail, aviation, waterways, and obviously transit. So let's talk a little bit about these suite of plans. Let's take a little bit deeper dive of what these plans are. The first is the Georgia Freight and Logistics Plan. And in early 2018, ATRI said Georgia had the second best freight and logistics plan in the country after Texas. We're still not happy about that. We appreciate the recognition of being second and having 48 people behind us, but I'm still mad at my friends in Texas. We'll do better. But in fact, I would suggest to you that back in 2012, the State Transportation Board actually adopted our first freight and logistics plan. And that was sort of before freight and logistics planning and transportation departments was cool or even federally required, which came along in the FAST Act. So in 2018, we did an update to our freight and logistics plan. And also through the FAST Act, the U.S. DOT is now working to focus on 4 key sectors that we've already talked about: agriculture, energy, natural resources, and manufacturing, to be a national freight plan that has to come forward out of the FAST Act, and I know they're working on that now. But this vision and purpose, I'm going to point you to the slide for a minute. I think this vision and purpose is still very solid that we started with back in 2012, and will suggest that this may be sort of the vision and purpose of this commission. I was trying to say council and committee, commission, to move forward. So, you know, I hate to read things, but I think this is important, that Georgia will be the global gateway of choice, providing reduced travel time to market, superior supply chain efficiency, reliability from destination to end customer. And the purpose is to identify freight and logistics needs and opportunities and recommend strategies for investing in highways, rail, maritime ports, and air cargo. I mean, that's pretty succinctly said. And so that's sort of our vision and mission as it relates to freight. And so let's take that vision and purpose and sort of use that as our navigational buoys, if you will, for this Freight Commission going forward.
Commissioner, can we see,
Yes.
does anybody have any questions to this point? I have one quick question, and that is, with your freight and logistics studies that you've done, Do you know how much freight comes out of Savannah that really doesn't need to come to Atlanta, and could go around Atlanta, or
Stay tuned.
is that coming later?
Stay tuned.
Okay.
I'm gonna leave you hanging.
He's still
All
dying.
right, and that may be a UPS question, actually, or a
I think there's
or a Home
certainly
Depot
some,
question.
certainly some people around the table that have that.
Okay.
I'm gonna address that in a higher level.
Okay,
Good,
thank you.
great question, though, because that's one we get often. So when we started this freight and logistics plan, we involved the private sector, which is key. I think that's the great thing about this commission as well, is having the private sector here with experts that really understand freight and logistics industry that help guide us going forward. And so, in addition, I think you'll see there, we had the Center for Innovation for Logistics out of the Department of Economic Development. I want you to know that we meet with them monthly. So we're in tune with what's going on over economic development and working with the center. And also, we meet with the Georgia Ports Authority regularly as GDOT. And so it has to be this team approach for economic development and moving freight throughout Georgia. So we started with that principle. That principle is being conveyed today through this commission. So let's take a little bit deeper dive by mode now about our plans and the info that comes out of the plans. The first being air cargo. Now, air cargo only represents about 1% of the total cargo volume, but it's about 35% of the value, which is a high value issue. If you think about it, this is probably the most costly way to move freight and cargo. So whatever that is high valued things such as electronics, perishables, pharmaceuticals, and sensitive equipment. And I even heard that race car teams use a lot of air cargo to move parts very quickly, which I thought was pretty cool. So how is freight carried by air? Dedicated all cargo flights, but also in the belly of passenger planes as well. So it moves in, as you would think, as the picture showed a minute ago, or this picture that shows air cargo, but also just in passenger traffic. The efficiencies obviously are understood. It's fast, it's high speed, very reliable as far as accuracy of arrival. It's easy to track. It's global. Lower risk, and it's high security if you think about anything that flies these days. The inefficiency, sort of, if you will, or the negatives is, again, cost, and you've got size and weight limitations as well, and the weather will impact flying sometimes. So those are sort of things to think about. Here's a little bit about Georgia air cargo statistics. As you might imagine, Hartsfield-Jackson International is the leader in the state, and you can see the national ranking is 17th in the nation. So let me just highlight some of the great things they're doing, because they see air cargo as a critical for their future. They've just completed about 120,000 square foot warehouse that's dedicated to air cargo capacity, and at the South Air Cargo Facility. So that grew their footprint by about 25%. They just completed a roadway and truck staging for 4 South cargo buildings to relieve congestion, so they've reoriented the way the freight comes in and out of the airport. Part of their plan is a phased expansion with a goal of adding up to 1 million square feet of warehouse space and airport parking, or airplane parking. And the proposed expansion is more than $200 million to do that, and that's in their capital plan. So they have plans to expand. But what you may not have known is that Albany, in southwest Georgia, UPS carries 100% of the volume there. I bet you knew that. So recent, yeah, and they've just added, I guess, a third daily flight, which has given significant growth to Albany. So there's actually no planned projects in Albany right now, but a big impact on air cargo from UPS. Savannah Hilton Head has a plan to relocate their existing air cargo facilities to another area of the airport, about a $15 million capital project that is needed to do that project, but they've identified that. Columbus currently has a FedEx service running from Columbus to Memphis to Atlanta back to Columbus. And currently they have no dedicated air cargo facility there, and the aircraft's just handled out of the FBO there. Augusta has cargo capacity in passenger aircraft only, but that sort of has diminished a little bit in the change of the aircraft fleet. Again, that was carrying cargo with passengers, and they've just changed their fleets from back to CRJs, and the capacity went from about 7,500 pounds to about 3,500 pounds in capacity. So we've seen a little bit of a tick down there. But then again, Swainsboro provides a UPS feeder service to Columbia, South Carolina, and they do about 10 trips a week there. So lots going on at our airports, and I think you can see the rankings are, again, pretty impressive. Albany being national ranked 100, I think is pretty impressive as well. And you can see where those rank. Here's a little bit about the commodities. I talked about those a little bit, won't dwell too much on this. The largest piece of the pie says miscellaneous mixed, so that can be all those things I talked about. Also mail, as you can see, is a big 22% of the share is mail and contract, that kind of thing of moving materials very quickly. So big share of that is miscellaneous and mail. So let's move into our next mode, waterways. That's pretty impressive if you ever get to see that when you're standing on River Street, to see a ship of that size come in, and we expect more of those. So just a little bit about GDOT's role in the waterways transportation. Under law, we are given authority to work with the Ports Authority. We're given the capabilities to work with navigable waters, and we are what's called the non-federal sponsor to the feds. What a non-federal sponsor means that GDOT provides the lands, the easements, and right-of-ways and relocations for construction projects. And so that means that we also partner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for navigational projects, and we work with them through project cooperative agreements and project partnership agreements. That's what it takes to do business with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. GPA certainly is very familiar with that, and we're partnered with them as well. And we turn out to be the local sponsor for the Savannah and Brunswick harbors for the intercoastal maintenance and the things that have to be there. So we do play a role. Our waterways division out of intermodal works with GPA very exclusively on the Corps. Turns out that federal law requires the local sponsors to provide 35% of costs for those kind of projects, and the feds pick up the other 65%. And of course, the largest infrastructure project going on now, everybody's familiar with, is the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project, deepening from 42 to 47 feet. Great statistics on what all this means. It's about a $973 million project, I think, at last cost. Georgia has committed over $260 million to this project. And I would say, too, it's interesting to note that Georgia pledged their dollars ahead of the federal. And it took some work. Ed knows this. In the ports, it took a lot of work from our senators and our congressional delegations and our governor to go ahead and get Georgia to front the money to get going when the federal money wasn't coming in. The good news is that the federal funding last year, and I believe the previous year, was the full amount needed in a year appropriation to do what needed to be done. We lagged behind, but Georgia paid it forward, and I think that's a great story to tell, not locally but nationally, that we were given the ability to get things going, because otherwise we would have been a lot further ahead. And there's a lot of activities. In your notebook in tab 8 later, there's all the activities associated with dredging. It's very impressive. I think it's 14 or 15 things that happen beside dredging. And most people don't understand that. And just I'm going to highlight a few of those things. We had to acquire acreage for mitigation. We've bought over 3,000 acres for mitigation. Purchased 137 mitigation credits at a cost of all this about over $24 million just for mitigation. So take a look at that. This next slide is part of that mitigation, was creating a raw water storage impoundment area for when the dredging actually takes place. This is done. It's a $40 million project, 97 million gallons of water to be put in that. That's about 150 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and this is absolutely the largest above ground pool in Georgia. All right, y'all bear with me. There's a lot of slides, a lot of data. So I didn't see the diving board, but I think there's one out there somewhere. But again, this is part of mitigation to be ready for when the inner harbor dredging actually occurs. And when that inner harbor dredging, the river that you think about when you're down in Savannah, when it's dredged, there's about 9.5 million cubic yards of material that will have to be removed from the bottom. So basically, if you filled up a football field, it would be almost a mile thick. Or put it in simple terms, we would cover up Mercedes-Benz Stadium with the dredge material. So that material has to go somewhere, and if you look at there's a lot of dewatering locations we have and areas that material has to go in. So pretty neat to consider. But you'll hear more about that at your next commission meeting, so don't want to get into too much detail, but a super complicated project. Next, let's turn to freight rail, and you can see our two Class 1 rails represented there. We didn't want to discriminate and put one and not the other, so we're lucky to have two Class Rail 1 providers here in Georgia. Is very important. Part of Georgia's duties is to create a state rail plan. 2015 was our last rail plan. It has to be updated every 5 years, and I'll follow up in a minute and tell you what we're doing to move forward to update that. But what's in a state rail plan? We update the inventory of the rail network assets. We coordinate with all the key rail stakeholders. We want to articulate Georgia's long-range rail transportation plan, identify freight and passenger rail needs and opportunities, and then prioritize short and long-term projects. Sort of the key issues that come up in the rail plan are dealing with grade separations of building bridges over railroads. And I can tell you, as trains continue to get longer, and we want them to continue to get longer to move more freight on rail, issues with being able to get across the tracks in rural Georgia becomes a real issue in all of Georgia because the trains are longer, the crossings are blocked longer, and I can tell you just over the last 2 years, we've had many, many cities and counties come in here saying we need to get the bridges over railroad tracks. So we deal with that. We also deal with vertical clearances so that you can double stack the containers. We look at where those challenges are. We look at, obviously, the state-owned railroad line, which I'll show you in a minute. And we talk about rail congestions and then the connectivity between the ocean ports, being in Savannah, and the inland ports. And we also look at the economic impacts. So the rail plan has lots of good information in it. It also talks about activity that we have. Since 2015, we've worked on about 41 miles of short line, completed 11 projects, 150 railroad crossing upgrades with the gates, lights, and bells. And I'll talk to you about some awards we got just in a moment. But here's a density of active freight rail. It's sort of like that one I showed you about freight movement earlier. And you can see the inset to the right. The darker the red the line, the more the tons move. And if you look at the freight movement in Georgia, you can see that north-south corridor, but also a lot of east-west that's a little bit more the orange-yellow color, which is, again, density. But take a look at that national map again. Other than Chicago, which we all know has tremendous rail traffic in and out of, if you look at what Georgia has, we're as good. Our lines are as red as the nation and about the same width. So, again, sort of a big deal. It's not just Georgia. This is a national impact. The heaviest routes in Georgia overlap with our two active inland ports, both in Cordele and up in Chatsworth. So you can see where those rail lines are. Now, a little bit of rail efficiency, things to think about. One rail car carries about 3.5 tractor-trailer loads of freight. One average train carries about 170 truckloads of freight. And the average mile of rail cars carries 18 times the freight as 1 mile of roadway. So you can see there's efficiency, and then 1 ton of freight can travel 470 miles on 1 gallon of fuel. That's pretty good fuel efficiency. So just again to highlight what the impact of rail is. In Georgia, we have 4,607 miles of freight lines, 28 freight railroads, 2 Class 1s, 26 Class 3s, and Class 3 means annual operating revenue under $35 million. Class 1s is over $450 million in revenue. So again, you can see sort of our rail map. That's the rail map that shows the lines. But here's the numbers. So in Georgia, we see about 172 million of tons moved on rail in Georgia back in 2017, most recent data we have. About half of that moved through the state. So that's one of the, to your question, Senator Beach, about half of that freight moved through Georgia, and about 6% of that moved within Georgia, so 11.1 million. So you can see that rail moves, and it sort of makes sense that rails, as you looked at that previous map, is expanding across the country, not only Georgia, but across the country. And let me get my notes here. About 44% originated or terminated here in Georgia. If you look at the total freight moves, you look at those tables down there. You can refer back to that a little later. A little bit more, what we see is at least a 2.2% annual growth is forecast of rail growth. About 1.1% of that growth will be inbound tonnage, and that turns into about 39 million more tons of freight moved. But if you look at the percent change as we see going forward, 51% growth factor that can happen when you look at inbound and outbound tons, which is pretty impressive. So, freight rail certainly plays a vital role in the future of freight mobility. But what's being hauled, what's moved on freight, here's a breakdown by commodity: gravel, coal, agricultural projects, forest products, chemicals, minerals, food products, plastics, rubber, lots of things are being moved. The top right of that table is interesting in the fact that it says, what's the future? I think those are things that, to be aware of. You see furniture and fixtures, what's that follow? People, population growth, you're furnishing residential areas. Obviously, machinery and manufacturing projects, again, supports a strong economy. So the bottom one down there is something I know GPA works on, and a lot of the people in freight logistics, is we don't like moving empty containers. So having a great export trade balance is very important, so the containers that are coming back to the port are not empty, and they have a good story to tell. All right, let's move forward to look at our short line railroad. Again, Georgia itself has almost 500, the state of Georgia, Georgia DOT has about 500 miles of state-owned rail lines, and we lease that to Class 3s and to Class 1. And the leases back in 2018 brought in about $309,000. 2019, I think we're about around $220,000 of lease. There was a reduction from 18 to 19 in some of the movement along the heart of Georgia tied to Kia and the shipments in and out of that, off that line. But all the lines are maintained under the revenue that we get plus bond money I'll talk about in a minute. And so what I want to do is highlight some of our short lines across the state and what they mean to the state. The first being Georgia Southwestern, from Bainbridge to Cuthbert and Columbus to Casita. About 102 miles, really supports the agribusiness. You can see the 635 jobs supported there. And it also provides access to Savannah via CSX interchange in Bainbridge. So some of the big industries you can see on the corner, Oxford Construction, Shaw Industries, Capital Materials. But there's some other industry that are not on state-owned lines, but are on this line, such as American Protein and Cuthbert, and Ampro Products. Also in Cuthbert, that's about 60 people between those two. So you can see what it does to support the economy. And one of the highlights is, again, the investment back in 2016. We put about $2.3 million in a rehab project for cross ties and upgrades there that really helped along this corridor for Texpar, a company called Texpar, which is fuel distribution in Bainbridge. They doubled their car loads from 2016. In 2018 was up 39%. And then we had Birdsong Peanut as well, saw 11% growth following the rehab project. So we saw that the investment had a return, that they were able to up their freight movement on those lines. Next highlight is Chattanooga to Chickamauga line. 49 miles in length, about 950 carloads in 2018. It interchanges with Norfolk Southern up in Chattanooga. And as you would guess, in this part of the state, it serves the textile industry very well. And you can see Shaw and Roper, Mount Vernon Mills, and you can see the group there, over 4,225 jobs associated with this line. So certainly plays a vital role in northwest Georgia. Also in heart of Georgia, some 249 miles in length. As you suspect, in this part of the state, supports agriculture and the timber industry, and you can see 915 jobs supported along that line. So great assets to have. When we look at funding of how we fund these, I talked about the revenue being about $220,000 or so in FY19, but you can see the General Assembly, House and Senate, put in budgets for and ultimately approved through the governor, some bond dollars over the years. Which is helpful, and you can see that in 2020, a nice budget spike there. We're very grateful for the investment of about $35 million in bonds that really help take on and work on these short lines. So In 2020, those bonds help us take these short lines from what was Class 1, which means operating speed up to a whopping 10 miles an hour, to Class 2, which gets you up to 25 miles an hour, so more than doubling the speed. Doesn't that sound fast, 10 miles an hour? That's sort of slow, right?
About how fast I got here this morning.
Okay. I don't know who to talk to about that. But let me talk about how that bond money has very much helped. Georgia has been very fortunate in the last two submissions to receive a federal grant from USDOT, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grants. And we've been able to pretty much leverage those dollars and get a 50-50 return, where previously we did not have any return. It was totally state dollars and state bond dollars. So we've been able to leverage about 7.8 and to get another 7.8. So we've got a lot of things to do. There's a lot of projects with that. So we're excited. We'll continue to submit applications as long as we have something that we can pledge back to the USDOT to show what our match is. So thank you for all in the General Assembly for putting those dollars forward, because we've been able to advance those and grow those numbers. Again, on the freight rail side, a great project Georgia Ports Authority's worked on. We've worked in partnership with them as they look to expand their rail yard. They'll talk about that in detail. But a tremendous project in a partnership where Georgia DOT is actually replacing a bridge right outside their front door along State Route 25 over a canal, and then to make the bridge long enough to go over the expanded rail facility with GPA. And again, that's the partnership between GDOT and GPA to make sure that we focus on freight and freight mobility. Georgia's inland ports, we stole this right from Georgia Ports Authority. They can talk about it in more detail. As you know, three inland ports, and the last one that's operational is up in Chatsworth, and what we know out of that is proposed that it will pull about 50,000 trucks off the roadway every year. And that's sizable when we get back and look at these next maps about truck movement in and around Georgia. So Gainesville's under development with a partnership with Norfolk Southern. So here's sort of the big reveal is what do we see out of our rail needs. When you look at what's in our plan and to you get from that 10 miles an hour up to 25 miles an hour, about $877 million in needs to upgrade the rail infrastructure. And that's sort of a 2040 goal that we have on the horizon. So you can see the challenge statement ahead of us. So as I mentioned, the freight plan has to be updated every 5 years. The rail program does, and so we're underway with that now. It's a great time to have this commission. It's a great time to run parallel tracks. So pun intended. Okay, y'all not with me. I'm sorry. I know this is long and tough, but we're getting there. So great opportunities. Now let's move into highways and talk about highways and freight. Again, sort of my favorite map. This is truck now. Just thinking about truck as it moves around the corridors, and this is really Georgia. But if you look at those arteries, how they reach out again all the way to California and radiate well past the Mississippi River. If you take that inset again, you can see how fat the tons get of movement the closer you get into Metro Atlanta. Again, 6+ million people. There's a reason that freight comes here. This next slide I really like, and it's probably a little hard to read, but this is like a little bit of like an eye test. The left side is 2015, the right side is 2050. The red means how much the truck volumes grow. So red means the highest truck volumes. The gray is the least. Compare, contrast at your monitor and look at where you see volumes grow. Now, I will tell you, red does not mean congestion like on your phone app always, but it's a pretty darn good indicator too when you look at these numbers that where it's red, you're probably got freight congestion. And these are just trucks, not cars. But you can look at volumes, and the corridors are the ones you expect. But yeah, look at the gray routes, which are non-interstates, and if you start looking at those in detail, you can see those turn gray to blue to different colors, and you can see the interstates from 2015 to 2050 start getting more yellow and more red as we continue to see freight growth. So it's a neat little slide. It's better if you flip back and forth sort of quickly, but,
Commissioner, we
yes.
have a question. Senator Gooch?
Can you explain briefly how you came up with that model?
This is actually data, actual count data, and then extrapolated into the future. So sort of like principles a little bit on freight growth, and you look at traffic models as well. There's a statewide model that looks at traffic growth patterns, as well as the Atlanta regional model, the 20 county, sort of 20 county area. So it's put in, you take the existing traffic and grow it by those models.
How do you count the trucks, the actual trucks on the road? I mean, is there technology that
Yeah,
does
right. The technology is able to determine what kind of vehicle it is.
Thank you.
So let's take a little bit deeper dive on statewide percentages of trucks. And this, Senator Beach, goes to your question of where are the trucks going and how many go through. Let me back up. So this is a real telling slide because this is what we get told often. Can't we just build a bypass around Atlanta to get all these trucks around Atlanta? The truth is the trucks are coming to Atlanta. We're again feeding the population. So if you look at up in Tennessee border, only about 22% of the trucks on 75 are actually passing through Georgia. So 78% are staying in Georgia. If you look at I-95 has the most pass-through traffic of any of the interstates at 68% or 53%, which sort of makes sense. So you've got freight coming out of Florida going up the eastern seaboard, and you got freight that's coming out of Savannah going up the eastern seaboard or to Florida as well. But if you look at 75 and you look at 85 and look at 20, most of the truck moves are within the state. There's not a lot of pass-through. So again, that's the one we always get. Why don't you just get all this freight around Atlanta? Well, it's not going around. It's coming to us. Now, are there notions about how we could do something like that? I think those are good conversations for the future about where does that freight flow and where does it get to. So this is, the next slide is very fascinating. This is inbound truck tons moved.
Got one quick question?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
So with regards to go back to the previous slide, those are figures for freight that's coming into Georgia, but not necessarily Atlanta. So I think the previous question was, could it go circumvent Atlanta? But the figures that are represented here are for the state of Georgia, right?
That's correct. This is the freight that's either originating, entering, or leaving.
Gotcha.
And so that sort of shows you how much is basically the pass-through percentage, how much is going through that's not staying in Georgia.
Okay.
I may have to take a deeper dive on if it originates in Georgia. I may have to slice that a little deeper. Not sure if I think it's all.
Okay.
But we can
So,
validate.
Commissioner, to your point, if it's coming to Atlanta and we're getting ready to deepen the port and take these huge super containers, are you saying that our truck traffic in Atlanta could triple?
I don't know if I could say that factually, but it's certainly will increase. Ed can help me on that, but it certainly arrives a lot sooner and a lot quicker as well. But freight volume continues to grow.
Freight volume is projected over the next 10 years to double in the Port of Savannah.
Okay.
Thank you. So this, again, is a statewide perspective of inbound freight and outbound freight. And usually I ask people, I said, where do you think the most freight moves happen? And everybody says Chatham County, Savannah. And they would be wrong. Not by a lot, but by some. It's Fulton County. Back to what we talked about is where freight is coming to. And you can see Fulton County in the darkest sort of brown there for inbound and outbound. But it's neat to see what's coming in and what's going out. So obviously Chatham County is both large for both because of the port. And you can see also down at Brunswick also is a big one. But look at the other counties, especially outbound, agriculture related. If you look at that outbound freight through Middle and South Georgia, it's pretty interesting. And if you look up the 85 corridor, also you see that's freight distribution. Things are coming in, get repackaged, and then goes out other places. But if you look at the density around Metro Atlanta, again, that's what we're talking about, the freight, that's where the freight is at. Interestingly to note, it looks like Gwinnett County is forecasted to have the fastest growth for outbound truck tonnage. By 2050, growth of 133%, so yeah, so that's a big growth there. And Fulton County and Chatham County will remain the top two outbound truck tonnage, obviously going forward. Some other interesting notes of growth that we see, that the fastest growing inbound truck percentages, over 200% by 2050, are Tifton, home of Target Distribution, Muskogee County and Columbus, Loudons County and Valdosta, currently Dillard's and Home Depot distribution there, and Albany and Daugherty County. So we continue to see tremendous growth in inbound trucking and in those areas, and then Gwinnett really growing outbound trucking. So what does this turn into? It turns into this map that we really don't like being on. This is from the American Transportation Research Institute. I know we have Rebecca Brewster on this commission, I believe. That's part of that. This is the annual freight bottleneck report. And the good news is we're not number one any longer. We've been number one for many years, for the freight bottleneck being Spaghetti Junction at 285 and 85. And I'm proud to say that that's moved up to Fort Lee, New Jersey is now number one. And I would like to claim that things got better in Georgia. They just got worse in New Jersey. We didn't get any better. They just got worse. So we have actually 3 of the top 10 freight bottlenecks in this nation. Based on this data you can see, I think you can understand that. And we also have 6 in the top 100. So this is not the list you really want to be on, but I'll tell you a little bit of a story about how we're going to address it. Next, just again, what does that freight turn into in and around Atlanta? If you look at this map too, and those freight bottlenecks, they're all mainly in Metro Atlanta, except for one or so. But what it turns into is this slide, of which the ARC did for their freight plan for Metro Atlanta. And you can see all the color map. It's a little fuzzy, I know. But these are the main arteries that we all know and love around Metro Atlanta. And what I can tell you is all of them need some form of investment for continuing to address freight movement and the freight growth that we're talking about. And these are very hard and complicated to do. So this again, is part of the challenge statement, is how do we move freight, not only when we think about freight on trucks, but once it gets to distribution centers and fulfillment centers, that ends up on a package on your front doorstep. We have to, I know the city's working on that. We're working with their team. How do these deliveries happen? Especially for density with high rises and multifamily, it becomes a challenge. So again, part of the challenge statement. This next one, again, is a little bit about freight. Great slide. 7 days from trucks, 500 trucks that left the Port of Savannah in 7 days. Here's where they ended up. Look at that coverage in 7 days. 60% of those trucks stayed in about the southeast, which is good. I mean, again, staying in and around the southeast, because obviously rail becomes more cost advantage the further you go. But it's pretty neat to see, and this was done with GPS data. So we'll give Senator Gooch one of those trackers, and we'll track him, figure out where he goes. So that's how we do it.
They're already watching.
All right, so we've got all this information, we've got these plans. How do we translate that into projects? So we plan, we have to work within the budgets we have that turn into projects. So we have all this data, we turn them into plans that come up with objectives to try to turn them into projects. And so it's always a reoccurring process. The planning process never ends. It just keeps going. So obviously, we put freight in our prioritization mix. Freight corridors, we've identified on the state, all the major freight corridors. So that becomes a point or multiple points given to projects when the planning staff goes through their process. Jay and his team, when they sit down and look at projects, they understand if they're a freight project and what the economic impact of those projects are. So that goes into our prioritization metric as we move forward. And federally, just talking about funding, because nothing moves forward without funding. Federally, there's really 3 major buckets that deal with things that help freight. The first circle on the left is something called the National Highway Priority Projects, or Program rather. It's actually the largest bucket of money. It's about $500 million to Georgia. But that does everything non-freight related as well. Anything on the national highway system, which doesn't mean it's a U.S. route. It just means it carries a certain amount of traffic. So that doesn't mean, sometimes those are local roads as well as state routes or interstates. The next category is bridge, which has a lot of limitation. It's a whopping $10 million that comes to Georgia for that. That has lots of limitations on it, but bridges, I suggest to you, and we'll talk about bridges in a moment, are critical for freight movement anywhere in the state. And then lastly, there's actually the FAST Act created a freight program, which is about $40 million a year. And those dollars are used on freight corridors. We're using them on our interstates. Recently, those dollars are going to 285 and 400, as well as I-16 and I-95. So sort of where we're using those dollars, which turns into our statewide freight network. As I said, we've identified a statewide freight network for non-interstates. Obviously, interstates are freight, but these are the major corridors that move freight north, south, east, west across the state. Over the next 10 years or so in the 10-year plan, I think we had over 50 projects identified that are over $2 billion that we need to be working on. Things like 441, US 27, State Route 17. If you look at this map, you can see things that still haven't been addressed, things that are under construction or things that are under development. But we have to create this system, this grid system, outside of what the interstates provide as well. So when we go back, we talked about projects and how we get to projects, and these talk about projects. The next slide came out of the actual freight plan and logistics plan. And it's a lot to look at. The green checks means things that are under construction or already open. And you can see the timeline to the right of 2012 to 2020 and those horizons. And so we have a lot of boxes checked, and we feel pretty good about that. We have other things that we're underway with, such as the bottlenecks, freight bottlenecks of interchanges, and we understand those things. But you can see there's still much work to be done. And again, these are just on the roadway side, if you look at that, besides some of the port things, but still lots to be done. And here's just a highlight of things in and around the Port of Savannah, what we call the last mile, which are really multiple miles. This is the strategic investment that the state's been making over the last few years that have really made a difference. So Jimmy DeLoach Parkway and Jimmy DeLoach Connector, which will bring basically a 4-lane highway, almost interstate-like, from right out of the ports, right from their front door, all the way to I-95, all the way to I-16. The last section of making it over to I-16 is under construction now. We're actually under contract to rebuild the interchange at I-16 and I-95 to modernize it so that freight can flow through that safely, and also widen I-16 down to 516. And so you can see there's a lot of things going on in and around the port that moves that freight, and again, a great partnership of what's going on. Now, sort of the state of the state, if you will. This slide's meant to wake you up. It's very bright. When we look at our interstates conditions, 99.8% good or fair. That looks fantastic, but let me tell you, that's, let's not be overly optimistic with that. Good or fair. Fair, you probably don't appreciate riding on. Fair is a technical term, and you can see that there's still a large share that's fair, and it takes continued investment. In fact, the American Society of Civil Engineers rated Georgia roads a C. And the national average is a D. So that's sort of like when I was in high school. I came home and said, hey, I was a little better than average, but it was still a C. They also say that the cost of deficient pavement in Georgia is about $260 a year. The national average is about $324. But let's be competitive. Let's be better than the nation, right? We want to be competitive. So we've been averaging about a $400 million investment in pavements each year across the entire state, not just interstates. We put about $100 million into interstates off the top in taking care of our interstates. And I remind you that the interstate system is now 60-plus years old, and much of that original pavement is still there, and it's way outlived this 20-year life expectancy. So it's a continual thing. You never catch up. It's just like taking care of your car and your home. You have to continue to take care of the maintenance. Now, if we take our plans that we've looked at and what does it mean, the freight investment in Georgia, we looked at the constrained, which means that's looking out over the 20-year horizon. That's financially constrained, means there's $5.7 billion of work to be done. The unconstrained list is what's the need that's out there that's unmet, $22.4 billion. So if this commission can come away with $22.4 billion, we'll be happy. We'll get to work immediately, if not sooner. But again, that's sort of, we sort of total this up. I would suggest to you that that number's probably low by the time you take inflation into account and project out for years. That number probably gets even larger, but that's in the roadway network. Just a little bit about bridges. We have lots of bridges in Georgia, and we have great rankings. When you look at, this is the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. Georgia ranks 45th, and 50 is really good, in deficient bridges. That means you don't want to be number one on that list. So we basically come out with 3.3% bridges deficient. But again, let me tell you that story. ASCE gave us a C+. We moved from a C to a C+, but there's a lot of bridges that need to be replaced across this state. Ideally, we'd like to replace 74 bridges on state routes only a year. That cost about $346 million. We've been investing in state bridges and local bridges somewhere between 270 to a little shy of $300 million in the last few years. So we're making a dent. Things are getting better, but we're not keeping pace, especially when it comes to the local bridges. 1,551 bridges are considered poor that need to be replaced across this state. That means they have a weight restriction or they're in such condition that they're not going to last, they have to be replaced. That comes to about $6.2 billion of need to replace 1,551 bridges. Out of the 1,551, yes.
Just a quick question. The bridges we're building today, what's the life expectancy of those bridges?
We try to get 100 out of them now. Back originally, most of them were built for 50. And then what has changed over time is if you go back into the 50s and the 60s, the vehicles that they were designed for are much different than they are today. So the tractor trailers have got bigger, the equipment's got bigger and heavier, and they just weren't built to hold those kind of loads. Oftentimes, it's not, the bridge would still hold the load it was designed for, but the vehicles now are just heavier than what they were designed for in the 1950s and 60s. So out of the 1,551, 1,406 are local bridges. So the number I gave you a minute ago, 350 million basically, were just state bridges. So you can see the tremendous impact that's needed. That means about 17% of all the local bridges are deficient and need to be replaced. So again, bridges are critical. And I always tell people, bridges, it doesn't matter if it's on the interstate or if it's on the county road, especially for agribusiness. If the farmer can't get his goods out of the fields into the distribution center or to the processor because they have to drive around a bridge because it's load restricted, that has a bottom line impact on, or that has an impact on the bottom line, right? So the rural bridge on a county road is just as important as an interstate bridge, in my opinion, because it does have an impact on commerce. Moving forward, good news is we are trying to work on some of these things. We saw a lot of green check box. The Major Mobility Investment Program takes 3 of the major bottlenecks and deals with those. We widened 3 interstates, two sections along 85, a section on I-75. We saw over and over I-75 being the freight artery of this state, doing something very novel of putting commercial vehicles in their separate lanes to improve safety and operations. These projects, all these 11 projects, total about $11 billion. And I want to be very explicit, we don't have $11 billion sitting in the bank somewhere. Most of these projects are public-private partnerships, which means the private sector finances them, and we make a mortgage payment over some term, usually 30-plus years. So this is a way that we are trying to address some of these issues, but very explicitly, we don't have the money. It's a mortgage payment, if you will. And what are the projects looking like? They affect, obviously, Metro Atlanta, where a lot of the freight is. The section of 75 from Macon to south of Atlanta going northbound only, because those things going southbound are empty containers. We're trying to focus on getting freight into Atlanta. And obviously down in Savannah that I talked about already. But what does this get you? What do these 3 projects get you? Some 331 new miles of roadway. 79 miles of those are for freight, for general purpose lanes. 176 are express lanes, and then 76 of those new miles are the commercial vehicle lanes. These projects, in fact, the economic return on investment is about a $2 billion growth in their gross state product because of doing these projects. But the kind of things you see are reductions in delay. On Interstate 85, we see in the year 2030 that the delay that would have occurred if you didn't do these projects is reduced by 56 to 69%. So it's a tremendous reduction in delay. On the interchanges at I-20 on the east and west side of town, a 19% reduction and a 30% reduction in those two interchanges in delay of vehicles going through those interchanges. The section on I-75 from Macon to south of town is about a 40% reduction in delay out in the year 2030. And I-16, you see about a 32% reduction. So you can see significant reductions in delay of travel. Even the express lane projects that provide benefit. When you look at the areas that have the highest freight numbers in the state, those happen to happen right up at 285 and I-75 on the north end, right there at SunTrust area and in the Cobb County area, in the Cumberland CID area and north. The highest freight volume of trucks is right there, just north of 285. Now, we did the express lane project, and you'd say, well, what does that have to do with freight? Freight can't ride in the express lanes. But what we've seen is the win that the general purpose lanes are now 10 to 15 miles an hour faster at the slowest time, and congestion has been reduced by an hour. So that's a win for freight as well. And people don't think about that. They just think about that's personal mobility. But the number one highest volume and the number 8 truck volume are both on that corridor. So we can't wait to see those numbers sort of drop down and see where the volume
Commissioner?
stands. Yes.
The Dean has a question.
Yes, sir, Dean.
On the, I left Macon coming here yesterday, and on the 7516 interstate, talk about that for a second on terms of time span and relief of traffic and the speeding up from the ports through that corridor.
Absolutely. And you saw you're in the middle of the thick of construction. That is the first 3 phases of 6 phases that are under construction. The total cost of that project in totality, I think, pushes a little over $500 million, maybe closer to 6. But the whole notion there was to relieve the bottleneck and improve the safety of where freight traffic and car traffic mixed, as we knew right there in Macon, with some really tight confines of the river and the railroad. So those projects are under construction now. The first phase, which was a lot of restoration and rehabilitation of the community, is complete. The 2 projects now are going on are the major interchange reconstruction that will absolutely improve traffic flow, and they're being staged. I think there's probably about 2 to 3 more years of construction there, and we intend to bid the other 3 phases out concurrently over the next couple of years and sort of stage it. The good news about that project is in each phase we build, there's something that gets better. So that project was just so big to try to do it at one time would have certainly have put the contractor in a bad, trying to figure out how long is it going to take to do a project that ultimately turns out to be about 10 years long of construction. So it is just that massive of a project. And
we're about 10 to 15 years late too.
Indeed. As I can attest personally that I worked on that project for over probably 15 years myself. And a very complicated project, but again, totally freight focused. I mean, safety focus number 1 always, but 2 is the intersection of what comes out of Savannah mixing with Macon traffic and the I-75 traffic, of which there's still a lot of traffic that comes 75 north that doesn't go 475. So critical investment, no doubt. And it complements what happens with the ports, being ready for what's happening at the port. So part of the strategic nature. Let me just, this has been extremely long and this is a lot of information, but just want to sort of challenge the commission of things that we think about looking forward. Federal transportation funding is going to have to happen over the next 16 months or so. And so we need to be thinking about and watching what's going to happen there and what the investment in freight is. There's a national study that was commissioned by Congress called the Future Interstate Study, what they found in that study very simply was that if you took the investment, the federal investment today, the total federal investment today, and applied it only to interstates, you probably could maintain the interstate system, but not expand it. So that just shows you the level of investment nationally needs to be made. They had a lot of suggestions about increasing funding and trying to figure out strategies how to deploy, but they looked out into the future to see, and they know how critical the interstate system is for this nation's economy. So that study's out there. We need to see how that informs Congress as they move forward. Truck parking is a real issue. This is a matter of being able to be successful to deal with truck parking now with electronic truck logs. This becomes an issue. Electrification of the fleet, as fleets now are looking to be electrified. What does that mean for revenue? What does that mean for how we work and put infrastructure in place that helps satisfy the electrification of the fleet? Platooning, thanks to the legislature and the General Assembly, Georgia is friendly, very business friendly for technology, and platooning is allowed of trucks being connected together. So that will become more of a reality. The technology is here today. Again, railroad separations and overpasses. Longer trains means more needs to get up and over railroad tracks for safety. And for just mobility in general. And then the things flying around in the top right of how are packages delivered, how is freight delivered is a lot of work going on in that arena. And we have to be agile. Georgia being as business friendly as we are, we want to make sure that we're agile, not inhibiting technology from bringing us forward. And there's a lot of moves in technology, I think, that really help us. So both Chairman Beach and Chairman Tanner, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your patience in a very long presentation. But again, wanted to give a big, broad stroke of all the things going on in freight in Georgia. We have a great story to tell, but I think it takes continued focus in the work of this commission that continues to drive Georgia ahead to be number one and keep maintaining our ranking. So thank you, and I'd be glad to entertain any questions or.
Well, Commissioner, thank you for that presentation. That was a great presentation. I would open it up for questions now. Yes, Brad?
Sir, revenue bonds from private sector, have they been used for major infrastructure improvements? I mean, you've done a great job with the federal and state funds. I'm just curious, any private sector revenue bonds that have funded major improvements?
No, not recently. Not private activity bonds or anything like that.
Is that something that would be entertained?
I think certainly in our public-private, PABs are certainly attainable, and that would be one thing we'd advocate for from the private sector.
And then secondly, autonomous vehicles, are you looking at any of that or testing any of that in this state?
Absolutely. We're actually working with a lot of partnerships, and what we're working on is deploying technology that connected, or the term of art now I think is cooperative and autonomous transportation, that vehicles can talk to infrastructure. We're actually deploying technology, one form of technology now in and around Metro Atlanta, some 1,700 traffic signals, to be able to communicate with vehicles. And we're continuing to work. It's a lot of different technologies going out there, but absolutely, that is.
And Mr. Skinner, I would tell you that the CIDs have stepped up to the plate. Our CID just last Tuesday voted to spend $308,000 on that to get that technology in the traffic signals so that it can talk to the cars. I know the Aerotropolis CID is going to invest $500,000. Gwinnett County, we got a lot of people investing to where these cars are going to be able to talk to each other. I guess it's a little over my head, but it's coming.
There's a lot going on. Georgia is positioned very well with our laws that we're open for business. And again, legislature's done a good job that we maintain that. Some states are very restrictive and they want to regulate, and that just kills innovation and technology. We want to be open for business. Obviously, safety, everybody's focused on safety. The people in the tech companies are. I mean, they know the one bad episode in Arizona set the industry back, so they know that safety is very critical. But we have a lot going on in that arena.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Senator Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Good job, Commissioner. First of all, you did a really good job today, and I'm impressed with the outlook you have on the entire state. Quick question on the 75 corridor, particularly from Atlanta to Macon, when talking about the truck lanes that we've discussed, where is the planning process on that project, and what do you have a timeline in mind for it?
Sure, we're actually in the early pre-construction stages of doing some surveys, doing some environmental work. It is on a 10-year horizon, so it's still not, it's not gonna be immediate. It's a bigger project. Forget to have to look at how many billion, it's a couple billion, I believe, off the hip, to do 40-some odd miles of interstate capacity. And, you know, if we look at that corridor, you see that right now, truck percentages are 20 to 30% trucks, so 1 in 3 is a truck. We see when we look forward, those numbers get to 40 to 60%, depending on where you are. So, and then what we know today, too, is that 75 needs capacity added. So we said, how can we do capacity that gives Georgia, one, a safe environment? Because we see that about 14% of crashes involve tractor trailers, but 25% of fatalities are involved tractor trailers. So it makes sense. If you have a crash with a tractor trailer, it's usually not good. So we said, can we make it safer? And then also give the competitive advantage for freight mobility, since we know that is a major artery of moving freight north to south in this state. How do we make Georgia super competitive? And I was thinking from the freight point of view is if I'm in dedicated lanes, I don't have to worry about cars in and out. That gives Georgia a competitive advantage, certainly something the ports can market and talk about when they want people to come to ports of call here in Georgia. And that it's an opportunity for technology as well. Because you're in a safe environment, you can put technology in that corridor where those trucks can platoon back and forth, and you can get trucks connected where that may not be comfortable if you're in the normal lane and you got 3 or maybe 4 trucks sort of nose to tail, and you're next to those or trying to get around those. So that's what we sort of saw in that. But again, we focused on northbound because that's how most of the freight's moving. And simply a financial reason that we're not doing southbound. But it came right out of this study where you saw that freight, we needed to work on capacity along I-75. So we're underway, but it's really early on. There's lots of policy kind of things that have to be looked at as well as when you separate those traffic, obviously where trucks get in and out, how they have access to imported areas like we talked about truck parking. They have to be able to get, when their time's up, they got to figure out where to park. So we have to work on those. A lot of work still to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? And I don't want to put Mr. Johnson or Ms. Smith on the spot, but you are 2 of our biggest customers. Home Depot and UPS are your biggest employers. I look at you as a customer. Is there anything challenging that we could do quickly to help you move product and you move packages? And, I mean, is there, you want to go first, Ms. Johnson? Or if you don't want to speak, that's fine. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but.
No, I don't mind at all. I think as we're having conversations around the congestion and talking about discussions around pulling folks off the road, I mean, whether it's going to be toll, whether it's going to be just passenger traffic, clearing the thoroughfares for freight is incredibly important to us. Ways in which the question that I had asked, which was, while there is a lot of freight that's coming to Georgia, there's major congestion points that continue to be the bottlenecks. Ways in which we begin to try and circumvent that winds up being incredibly meaningful for me as well as my colleagues that are throughout the Southeast. And so it continues to be a hot topic for us and areas that we would like to continue to evolve and be a part of those discussions. Congestion, I like the way you put it, begins to have a bottom line impact. The cost of doing business is oftentimes not easily understood by the public. And so I think the understanding with regards to congestion and how that kind of impacts bottom lines is increasingly important and a topic that's near and dear to us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Smith?
I would agree. Congestion is probably the major concern that we have, especially in the Atlanta area. We have about 8 million square feet of distribution in Georgia, much of that in the Atlanta area. So a lot of that's in Henry County in the 75 corridor.
Right.
So
Yes, it is.
yeah, so a decent amount of congestion is also a huge concern. One other point, just a question. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but with the port expansion, has there been a study on what type of additional freight we're expecting to come in, and if any of the flow patterns in the state are expected to change?
I would.
Do we think there will be more through traffic at that point?
I think that's going to be your tee up for your next session and maybe talk with GPA.
Okay.
And the answer to that is yes, there certainly are forecasting and understanding, and then we work collaboratively on trying to understand that as well and react and update plans, and that's part of this whole process of planning. So
Yeah, I think that'll be in our next meeting in Savannah.
And I would say too,
so-
to both of those, one of the things that we're looking at, and we will actually be on our web sometime, is reliability. So the variability is what kills people, right? If you have reliability, then you can plan for that, you can budget for that, you know what your bottom line cost is. The variability, when you can't get there on time, when you miss your window of opportunities to deliver, that has a real impact. So the more we can focus on reliability and make sure that everybody knows what that is, it still may be congested, but it's, some form of reliability. Those are sort of things we have to think about. Obviously, we want to combat congestion all we can, but the more reliable you can make it, the more predictable. The more predictable, you have a better sort of bottom line impact. You know what that is, and you can account for that.
Okay. Now I'd like to put Chris and Hala on the spot. As y'all recruit in economic development and we're recruiting logistics companies, are there any obstacles you're hearing from companies when you're out there recruiting them to come to Georgia and to Metro Atlanta?
I'll just say, and this is not going to be a surprise to anybody, I mean, it is, the whole traffic congestion in Atlanta is still just a huge issue, and they talk about it a lot. I think people are excited about Point A and the various people coming together to digitize logistics and work on supply chain, et cetera. But it's just, it doesn't go away. It's probably not going to go away. Although we've, a lot of people have done a lot of great work over time, we still don't have a great transit system. And I know we're working on that, which is excellent. So thank you for that. But it's, there's still just pushback, on the traffic. And we also try to point out that we're not number one in the bad stuff, but it doesn't, doesn't always compute. We could fix a lot of things, and reputationally, it's going to take a while for it to ease off. And I guess just to the point that was brought up by Home Depot, and I know we're going to do the Savannah portion during Savannah, but is the answer just a simple yes, there should be more through traffic once the port is deepened, or not?
I think, again, population drives a lot of this, so expanding population just means more goods have to come here. But to the extent, and I think obviously the conversation of railroads, the extent to anything that's long haul, that's not serving Metro Atlanta or even serving Metro Atlanta, the more you can put on the rail. We gave those numbers of how many truckloads you free up. That is good. I mean, that is very good, and that has to be part of the solution as well. I don't know the numbers themselves, Ed, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I'm not asking for specifics, just a kind of general yes, no, but, I guess we know the population trends, but, is in theory, if you deepen, is that volume going to increase more quickly than the population trends, so that will there be more through traffic? Because I think it makes the conversation slightly different.
We are working with the Mega Rail project and the Mid-American Arc to move business from roads to truck. That's on the through traffic. But some of that data is still being developed at this time as the project is still underway. It's a $200 million investment that the port is taking on today. And we hope to encourage through traffic rather than destination traffic. But as Russell has stated, the population as it grows in Atlanta, we will still continue to have a large portion of that directed towards Atlanta.
Yeah, I think the mega Mason yard that they're doing is a good example of how that's trying to get more to rail, and not only to serve a greater area than Atlanta. I mean, I guess you have a partnership with a couple other ports as well, and so it's not just serving Georgia, it's just the nation, in fact. So as their opportunities continue to grow, they're not just serving Georgia, they're serving the nation, which is pretty awesome. But
Chris?
We've got a good future.
I'll just echo, Mr. Chairman, what Hala said. When we hear the same thing statewide, but I'll also make the point, it's the companies that are already invested here that are also seeing the impact, that are also frustrated by it. And so I know we do a lot to focus ourselves to be attractive for new companies to move in, and that's always going to be important. But it's the companies that here that ought to be the priority in moving their goods and services, but also their people or what we're hearing more and more, and you're starting to see companies that are relocating from suburban areas downtown just to get access to that transit, or just so their folks don't have to drive as far or be sitting in that traffic every day. And so that's what we worry about. I think the primary here is how we're going to take care of those companies that are here invested in Georgia and part of our family.
Good point.
All right, Mr. Commissioner, I've got just a couple of questions for you before you leave there.
Absolutely.
You hit on a couple of things. Probably the two biggest things I'm hearing complaint-wise from fellow legislators is railroad crossing blocks, which we all know is an issue. Also, you hit on the truck rest areas. Truckers are now pulling over on all of our cutoffs, the sides of interstates, because they just don't have anywhere to go. But one of the things I think is important, and Senator Gooch and Jay and others who worked on House Bill 170, we always knew that was, there was different amounts that were thrown around, and the amount that we went with was the one that just generally maintained what we had, our infrastructure. And you've talked about a lot of numbers today just on bridges. If I heard you correctly, and tell me if I'm incorrect, we need about, let's see, you got $35 million a year basically in funding for not bridges, but railroads, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Over a period of 20 years, 25 years, if you had $35 million a year, that's the number you need to hit. This year, the General Assembly was able to do that for 2020. But in doing that, we took that money from other things, which included bridges, which also need that $100 million or so that we've been putting in additional bonds every year. So the moral to that story is there's just not enough money currently to not only keep up, but to improve our infrastructure. And then also the bridge, and I know all of us who represent our communities know from our local county commissions and cities, we get hit up for bridge replacements on a regular basis. 1,551 bridges need replacing. I think it was pretty staggering that 1,406 of those were local bridges. And I know a lot of those are extremely important to our local communities. One of the things that would be helpful for me, and as we move forward with these meetings over the year, and as you a member of the commission, to be able to take a look at all the dollars you said we were going to need over the next 25 years with the dollars that we currently have through House Bill 170 funding and other state funding, and then come up with what does the need outstanding look like. You've done a good job, GDOT's done a good job working with CERTA and others with the managed lanes, funding those through public-private partnerships. We've done a good job as a General Assembly providing House Bill 170 funding, but there's still a need. And I think it's important for us to really understand and get our hands around what that number looks like over the next 25 years to really not only be able to maintain, but as Georgia continues to grow to improve. And I know none of us like to spend money, but if you're running a business and running the state's running a business, there has to be an investment in our infrastructure to be able to get a return on our investment. And that's what I think is important that we, at the end of the day, out of this commission, understand. The last thing I'll say is, talking about House Bill 170, we knew House Bill 170 had made great improvements in our infrastructure, but we wanted to really understand what that was. And I'll point out to the commission in tab 11, we had worked with GDOT and the Carl Vincent Institute, and Carl Vincent did about an 8-month-long study looking at the effects of House Bill 170 on our infrastructure and what return that brought back into our economy. Some of the results of that are in tab 11. I think the full report is on the GDOT website. If it's not, I know we can get you a copy of that. But it's almost a 2-time multiplier. So when we invest in infrastructure, it brings more back into our economy than we're spending. So it's a good return on investment. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as we continue to have these conversations. And I think we have to have that conversation with the citizens, that those of us who are elected have to make these difficult decisions during the budget process, have to have those conversations with our constituents. But just want to mention that House Bill 170 has worked. It's worked on improving infrastructure, but it's also brought more back into the economy than we spent as a state. So thank you, Commissioner, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to get those answers.
Absolutely. Glad to do it. Thank you.
All right, next, we've got Director Matt Markham from the Georgia Logistics Ecosystem with the Department of Economic Development. Appreciate him being here and the partnership that they have with GDOT and with all of us that serve in the General Assembly. So, Matt, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Chairman Tanner, Chairman Beach, and the rest of the commission for letting me come speak to you guys for just a few minutes today. I was telling somebody before we started that trying to follow Russell McMurray on a transportation presentation is like trying to follow the Pope with a sermon. So I will be briefer, but I do feel like there's a good connection between what Russell was talking about, the incredible infrastructure assets that we have, and how that translates into jobs and investment in Georgia. And so that's one of the things that I want to focus on and just highlight to you guys as you continue to do your work. But quickly, let me just sort of introduce who we are. We are part of the Department of Economic Development, the Center of Innovation for Logistics. So we are part of the state of Georgia's entity that works on promoting jobs and investment in the state. We primarily work with existing companies as opposed to just working on the recruitment side of bringing new companies in, which we will help with. We do primarily work with existing companies in the state, trying to help them find connections to resources that they need to be successful, whether it's through other private sector entities, our public sector, university system, resources to those, resources to great things like the Department of Transportation, our ports, as well, and trying to help them be successful and grow jobs here in Georgia. So an example of a project we do, and Stephanie, you were asking about looking at the impact of the ports and how that's, that freight traffic might change upstream. Project that we recently partnered with Georgia Tech and the Georgia Ports Authority was an arrangement to begin looking at the impacts of those big ships that are coming in with the growth of the port, the deepening of the harbor, and the increased volume that are expected to come through there. What are those impacts not only to the operation of the ports itself, but then that sort of upstream impact on companies and distribution centers and trucking companies, motor carriers, so they can begin to understand how they may need to optimize their business in reaction to that. So that's an example of that kind of partnership that we brought together and working with our universities, our public sector, and ultimately our private sector to help them be successful in there. So this is the point in the presentation. When you work for the Department of Economic Development, you must remind everybody we are the #1 state in the nation for business, 6 years in a row. And so that it is in many ways due to our logistics assets and our infrastructure assets that make us stand out. Russell had pointed out in his presentation some of the key industries that we focus on. And so this is from 2018. Just an example, the FY 2019 numbers will be out soon, but they'll be similar to this in showing that there's significant investment with industries that are heavily dependent on our logistics infrastructure and those transportation assets that we have. And so having those assets in place and continuing to focus on how we can improve them will be vital for us to continue to see these kinds of numbers going forward and continued growth. In a recent study that I saw, U.S. businesses in 2018 spent $1.64 trillion on logistics. That's companies nationwide. And just a little over $1 trillion of that was on the transportation-related costs. So these are significant amounts of money that companies are spending on transportation and on logistics. And so it is vital to them to be able to find the efficiencies and to find the ways that they can manage their business more effectively. And so states like ours and commissions like you that are looking at ways to make sure we remain competitive is going to make us even more attractive to companies going forward and being successful. So, whoops. So again, Russell had pointed out, I know a lot of the sort of key factors in trade, but we are the 7th largest importing state and the 11th largest exporting state. Total trade with the world, just under $140 billion with all of those projects that have already been listed on the books, the deepening of the harbor, the mega rail project, the inland ports. We only expect those figures to grow and for us to increase in competitiveness, which again puts that additional strain on our infrastructure. But we are an international gateway, and so these are things that we continue to focus on with the department and understand that those are the kinds of things that make us a competitive state. So Wanted to talk a little bit about now a recent study that we completed in partnership with Selig Center for Economic Growth at UGA, and you have a copy of this report here. You can look at it later on. I just wanted to point out some highlights. The Selig Center at UGA, they're the same people that do the economic impact reports for Georgia Ports Authority. They do this UGA Economic Outlook every year, so it's a kind of one of our really strong experts in economic impact to look at the impact of the logistics industry in Georgia. And so, not surprisingly, given all that we have talked about, the logistics industry has a very strong impact on jobs and investment in the state. 181,000 direct logistics employment jobs in 2018, and that's jobs specifically in logistics-related industries, so the industry of moving goods and warehousing, transportation, all of those things specifically. That's 181,000 direct jobs, 15,000 establishments. You can see $2.7 billion in state and local tax revenue, so it's a very important impact to our state and local economy to have those. And from our the sort of impact analysis, looking at 1 in every 14 jobs in Georgia, so 362,000 jobs, owe their existence to the logistics industry. So that's the direct jobs plus the indirect effect and induced effect of having those jobs and that investment in Georgia that it has on jobs in the state. Just to give it a little bit of comparison, so the agriculture industry, our state's largest industry, their economic output is 73 billion, so a little bit larger, but their jobs number is 392,000 in impact jobs versus the 362,000. So the logistics industry has almost as big of a job impact overall as the agriculture industry. So it's a very important part of our state's economy. Just to break it down a little bit, this is in the private sector. Not surprisingly, most of those jobs are transportation related jobs, almost 80% of those, with another large segment being warehousing and then service industry as well. Breaking down even further within that transportation segment, almost half of those, 43% are road-related jobs, 31% air-related with the Atlanta airport, not surprisingly. We have a high concentration of air cargo-related jobs and air-related jobs that help give us that competitive advantage as well. This is kind of the statewide breakdown. We were able to break it down by region based on the service delivery regions for the that the department uses. And the top 3, not surprisingly, number 1 is the Metro Atlanta region. Number 2 being the coastal Georgia region, so down in Savannah on the coast. And then the third one is Northwest Georgia, so up in the northwest part of the state, being the 3rd highest concentration of related jobs for the state. So in this, sorry if this slide is a little fuzzy, I lifted it from the report, but this is sort of relative concentration. So everything to the right of the red line is where Georgia exceeds the national average in types of jobs, and everything to the left is where we're below. And you can see we exceed the national average in almost every category related to logistics jobs. In fact, the industry grew as a whole by 30%. And this was a different data source than the other one. That's why it's through 2017, those comparative data. So, but the numbers stay roughly the same. Far on the right side, you see in air transportation, we have a very strong competitive advantage in that. And as Russell said earlier, that's we're, I think, 18th in the nation in Atlanta. So we're not in the top 10 in that. We have a lot of potential for growth there. And so we already have a strong competitive advantage. So as the Atlanta airport and the airports continue to make those investments, we're poised to be able to be prepared to see that growth in there with that long competitive advantage. Those are also good. Those are, tend to be high wage jobs, and those are the types of jobs we like to see in our state as well. Warehousing. So, Russell had pointed out the slides with the larger sizes. This is a dot just of all the different locations. More than 800 million square feet statewide. We are the 6th largest. Atlanta's the 6th largest market in the United States. Warehousing employment was the fastest growing segment of employment for the state, 70% of growth. So that's a top place for us to grow. That's one we will continue to see growing as the state continues to grow, as we get more transportation. The good thing about warehousing jobs is as warehouses continue to increase, they continue to strive for more efficiency. and more optimized operations. They're investing more heavily in technology, more heavily in opportunities to work better, which is not necessarily looking to replace jobs, but to help the jobs, the people in those jobs work better, and also to create potential for more highly skilled jobs in the future as you move from just picking and packing and moving the production to actually being the people who maintain the systems, program the software, manage those accounts. So it's a potential we see as it continues to grow for those jobs to become, more highly sought after and skilled jobs that we can continue to see. An example of that, Kroger recently announced a new distribution center that they're building in Forest Park area that's designed to provide service for online grocery orders, so that direct-to-consumer delivery. And that's a highly automated warehouse that they're going to build with advanced robotics to support the human labor that's working in there. And those are some of those examples of the kinds of trends that we can see in warehousing that can really impact the state and really impact jobs in the state. I won't go into too much detail here because this is stuff that Russell did, but it is worth pointing out. We're looking to see a population increase. We're looking to see freight growth increase. And so as we prepare for this future, the kind of work that you guys are doing is going to be very vital to helping make sure we remain competitive in doing it. One thing that I like to point out to people when I talk, because everyone focuses on e-commerce now and the idea of Amazon and moving those goods, and it is a very big component of what we're seeing, but it still only accounts for about 10% of all retail sales. So, and they're projecting growth of that over the next years. And so to think that there's so much more that could come, in freight growth, especially in that last mile and those connectivity issues as it grows, when we think that e-commerce is still only 10% of overall sales. So that sort of leads to kind of the last idea of this future of mobility, is looking at, thinking about how companies are looking at their supply chain and their distribution, and the way that they need to meet their customers. And there's a lot moving towards looking at the last mile, looking at how do we provide the delivery expectations that consumers are expecting now. And so it's 2-day delivery now, it's same-day delivery. People are looking for deliveries not just in their home, but deliveries to their car or deliveries to their work. And so it's changing. I know because I know UPS is doing a lot of work and trying to understand potential technology solutions and ways that they can be much better about delivering customers to where they need to be. And those have broader infrastructure consequences. So looking at things like how does it impact traffic on your downtown streets? How does it work in your urban areas? And then where the warehousing decisions might be made to support those things. And so I think you guys are doing the perfect time to be looking at these issues, and I really appreciate all the time and expertise that you are lending to it. Just wanted to provide a little bit of context for you to show that this is really important for our economy and really important for jobs in the state. And we're happy to assist in any way we can. So thank you.
Any questions? Brad?
In any of your studies, one of the things I keep thinking about is intermodal efficiency. For the Port of Savannah, and probably that could be answered next session, how balanced is the container traffic to and from the port? My problem I've always had is at Southern Pacific or other places was making certain the port traffic containerized was balanced. That allowed me to be much more efficient on the intermodal movement.
Currently today, we're about 46% export, 54% import overall. So we're one of the most balanced markets in North America, if not the most balanced market.
And do you have the flow of that not only to Atlanta, but to other segments of Georgia and outside of Georgia? Just where the boxes come from and where they go?
Unfortunately, we do not.
Okay.
Once it goes outside the gates on the rail or truck, due to the bill of ladings and how they're set up, we don't get all of that detailed information.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'll make a couple closing remarks, and then I'll turn it over to Chairman Tanner to close us out. But I will tell you there was a lot of information today, and the one thing you can really get out of these presentations is logistics is a big business. Supply chain is a big business. That, and I want to tell you, when I first started on the Greta board years ago, agencies didn't even talk to each other. I'm so proud of the Department of Economic Development, the Port Authority, GDOT, everybody communicating with each other and working together and really looking at it, and I got to give Russell a lot of credit, looking at it from the customer standpoint. What's best for our citizens and our customer, and the GDOT board looks at that also. And I can tell you that really sticks out in my mind, that we're all working together to solve these solutions, to come up with solutions to solve these challenges we have. Because we want to make sure UPS and Home Depot and these companies that are here, and to Chris Clark's point, the existing companies, sometimes we get so enamored with recruiting companies, and that is a kind of a sexy thing to do, to recruit a new company and have them come to Georgia. But we got to take care of existing business. And so I just want to thank all of y'all, and we need your input. You guys know a lot more about this than we do as elected officials, and so we need your input in how we solve these challenges. But I do think that it showed clearly that it's a big business, and the investment that the state's willing to make will have a great return on its investment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chairman Tanner.
Well, thank you again, Matt and Commissioner, for those presentations. Like the chairman said, great detail and information. One of the things I know, one of the handouts, the presentation may not be in your folder. Chelsea will be sending that out this week, so you'll get all these electronically. I also want to thank our staff that's here today, Abby and Chelsea and Jenna and Jenny. They do a great job for us, making all of us look good and working to prepare all of this for us ahead of time. So thank you to them. And again, thank you to the Commissioner, the GDOT board members who are here, and the GDOT staff for hosting us today and putting together this information, and for all the work that gets done throughout the year around freight. We also, if you've not received, if you're on the commission, you've not received an email from either Chelsea or Jenny, let them know so they can make sure they have your email address correct. And then also make sure they have your best contact information. If you've not received them, just get them that information. They will also be sending out later this week the information about our next meeting. It's going to be in Savannah on the 25th and 26th of September. And the idea there is to talk about the port, to talk about the imports and exports that come through the port, and to go deeper into the conversation around what they're expecting to come into the state, how that's going to increase, where we expect that to go, how that's going to affect our rails, our traffic on our roadways. And we'll also be able to, we're going to have a tour of the port for the commission members. It'll be a 2-day meeting. We'll start in the afternoon of the 25th, give you an opportunity to travel down that morning. We'll have a short meeting. We'll have the tour of the port. We'll have a commission dinner that night. The next day, we'll start first thing that morning, and then we'll get out early afternoon to give you time to travel home. So it'll be a 2-day meeting. Hotel information, all that will be sent out this week. So other than that, unless does anybody have anything else, any comments, any closing remarks they'd like to make? All right, if not, we will stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.